Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled The Importance of Digital Archiving for ATE. It's my pleasure today to introduce today's presenters. Let me start with Rachel Bauer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Rachel, will you introduce yourself and then your colleague as well?
Of course. Hi, Mike. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here again. Some of you may have joined us for our series of sustainability webinars, and we're thrilled to be coming back today with this very important topic on archiving. I'm pleased to be here with Kendra Boda, who's one of my colleagues at AT Central and Internet Scout. Kendra, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly and then kind of go through our goals today?
Sure. Thank you, Rachel. I'm happy to be here today, and I'm also happy to see that so many of you are joining us for today's webinar. As Rachel mentioned, my name is Kendra Boda, and I'm Metadata and Information Specialist with AT Central. I'm responsible for the AT Central Resource Portal and for the archiving service. And I also serve as a direct contact for the AT community for members like you. And I am always happy to answer archiving questions or provide any assistance that you might need. I hope that we will provide some good information for you today, and I also look forward to hearing from you individually after today's webinar. So, my apologies. Our goal today is to answer these three questions. Rachel's going to start off by talking a little bit about the ATE program and about the tools and services that ATE Central offers. I'll then discuss the ATE Central archiving service and why it's important not only for individual project and centers to archive, but why archiving is important to the ATE community as a whole. We'll then talk more about how we can help you. The majority of our presentation is going to focus on the ATE Central Archiving Service. Specifically, we'll look at the archiving checklist and an archival planning worksheet, which are two tools that we provide to the community to assist you with your archiving efforts. We'll talk about the NSF archiving requirement and what it means for you specifically. And then we'll wrap up today's webinar with more information about our new online submission form, which will allow you to submit your materials for archiving directly through the ATE Central website. But before we get started, I believe that Rachel has a poll question for you. Rachel?
Absolutely. So Mike, can you open that first poll for us? So we always like to know who's on the call with us. It helps us target the presentation, and it's always just interesting to see who's joining us. We'll see if we have some folks who are in that first bullet point. They've been funded under the current RFP. Lots of folks who are funded under a previous solicitation, and some folks who are not funded but who are writing a grant, which is great. And if you're somebody who put in other, there are a couple of you, good time to test out that chat box and let us know who you are. We wondered if we might have some TACT folks on the webinar today. So you're welcome to go ahead and put that in the chat box if you'd like. Well, Kendra, this isn't really very surprising, is it? It's great to see so many people who are funded under this most recent solicitation because, you know, what we're talking about really is important specifically for them, but really for everybody. And most folks are with the ATE program, not surprising, and a few who are writing grants. Kendra, I can't hear you at the moment. Are you still with us?
Oh, I am. Yes.
There you are. Good. Just wanted to make sure. It looks like we have a couple people who've told us a little more about themselves in chat. We have someone who's jointly funded, and we have somebody who's with a specific organization in Washington State, it looks like. All right. Well, I think that's great. Thanks so much, Mike. We can close that, and we'll move along here. So it looks like most of you are affiliated in one way or another with the ATE program. So most of you know that this is an NSF funding stream. with a real focus on technician education, and a real key part of the AT program is that community colleges are actually in a leadership role, which is unusual for the National Science Foundation. Big focus on partnerships, particularly with industry, of course, relationships with other educational institutions, and again, a real interest in developing those pathways between educational institutions from high school all the way up through universities. Briefly, if you are a little less familiar with AT Central, we're really here to help amplify the impact of the ATE community, to really offer all kinds of support to projects and centers. We act as an information hub and portal. We have a resource collection where we pull together the materials that are created, the deliverables that are created under NSF funding. We develop all kinds of services and tools for the community. You probably get our monthly newsletter. The archiving service, of course, is one of those tools that we're talking about today, one of those services rather. And then we do lots of outreach and dissemination. We do our own outreach, promoting the work of ATE, and we support the projects and centers in their own outreach efforts. A little bit more about the archiving support. Kendra's going to really dive deep into this, but it is really a community-driven service. We look to you to find out where you have needs, what you need help with. It's come out of needs that were shared with us from the community, in part around sustainability. This is a way to sustain the very important work that you're doing by archiving your electronic materials with us, your digital materials with us. And of course, it also speaks to NSF's data management plan requirement that began in 2011. Not surprisingly, that's when we started doing archiving for the community. More recently, NSF has asked anyone who's funded to archive with us as a requirement. So that's a requirement of your grant if you were funded in 2015 or beyond. And we offer things like this webinar, guidelines, and other support materials for folks in the community. So I want to turn it over to Kendra now, who's really going to get into the meat and potatoes of today's presentation and talk to you a little bit about what archiving is and how we can be of help to you. Kendra?
Thanks, Rachel. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about what an archive is. This quote from Trevor Owens, who is widely published on the topics of digital collecting and preservation. In this quote from the Signal, which is a Library of Congress preservation publication, states that archives have really come to mean a lot of different things in different contexts, and I would add to different people as well. So when you think of the word archive, you might think of documents that were created by a particular organization. If you think National Archives, they collect a very small portion, but documents that were created in the daily course of action of government agencies. Perhaps you think of historical documents of a particular person, like the papers of Eleanor Roosevelt. You've probably heard a lot about web archiving. The Wayback Machine is an interesting project in web archiving. Your email client might give you the option to archive, or perhaps your blogging software gives you the option. So we think about archiving in a number of different ways. I thought it would therefore be important to talk about what we mean by archive when we say the archiving service at AT Central. So the ATE Central Archive is a virtual space where deliverables and select administrative documents created by members of the ATE community are collected, stored, and made available in a digital format. Now the word stored is highlighted here. Storing resources on ATE Central servers is largely what differentiates an archived resource from other resources cataloged in the ATE Central resource portal. So let's take a look at an example to highlight the difference. So the ATE Central Resource Portal contains about 5,500 or so metadata records. One of these records is illustrated for you on the right-hand side of the slide, and some of the content is then enlarged on the left. So all metadata records will have a title. Here in the example, we have an overview of hybrid electric vehicles, HEV technologies. Towards the right is the logo of the project or center that contributed this resource. This is from the Center of Advanced Automotive Technology. Our metadata records have a description and a screenshot of the material that is being covered. And then towards the bottom of this screenshot, you see the beginning of some of the metadata that we collect. For example, there's a URL, the associated files, which we'll discuss in a moment, creator, publisher, but this is only a snapshot. If you were to see the entire record, you would see the ATE area is Advanced Manufacturing Technologies, Automotive Manufacturing. The subject of the resources provided, the date issue, which in this case is 2011. You'd also find metadata about the resource type, the format, the intended audience of the resource, education level, and any information about access rights or content licenses that we might have. So all metadatas have this. Now, towards the bottom here, you see the circle around the URL. We collect resources at AT Central in one of two ways. The first is that a project PI or someone associated with a project or center provides a URL or a file of a resource that they have directly to us. We also actively go out to your individual web pages and look for new and interesting content that we think might be good for the AT Central portal. Either way, we provide a link to the material if it is available online, as illustrated in this example. And when we find new materials or when the project PI provides us with a link to the materials, we create one of these metadata records detailing the resource. Now, having the URL link directly to your websites is really valuable. This is something that we want to do. We want individuals who find your materials through our websites to navigate back to your websites. We want them to see the other materials you've created. Perhaps they'll find information about other activities or events that you have planned. The problem with providing URLs is that they're not necessarily going to always be available. They might break. Sometimes URLs break because a project or center has reached the end of their funding cycle and their web page is no longer available. Sometimes a project or center might decide that they want to take a resource down and replace that material with something newer. In either case, that URL is going to break. And so when you archive with us, what happens is we attach a digital copy of your resource directly to your metadata record. So in this example, you see at the top, there are two attachments. One says Auto 279 HEV updates highlighted PDF, and then there's a zip file also attached to the record. So this is what makes this particular resource archived. If that URL breaks for any reason, we can simply remove it from the record and we still have access to those materials and can still provide access to the materials even after the URL has been removed. So that's what it means to archive. We attach digital copies of resources directly to our metadata records.
Kendra, we had a question from someone on chat. There's been a little bit of chatting going on. One person asked if this was free or if there was a fee associated with it.
Yes, indeed. The archiving service is free to the ATE community. There's no fee associated with it whatsoever. Are there any other questions you'd like to get to now, Rachel, before we move on?
I think we've sort of chatted through them. There has been some interest about file size. Are the digital, is there a file size limitation for materials and a limit on the number of files stored? And I know you're going to talk about that in a little bit, but I didn't know if you wanted to just answer that.
Sure. So there's no limit in terms of the number of files stored. In terms of maximum file sizes, we do have recommendations that we'll be looking at a little later on. And when we talk about the submission form, it does have, it only accepts files up to 1 gigabyte. So you can attach some pretty sizable files to that. But if you do have file sizes that exceed that for some reason, you're always more than welcome just to contact me directly and we can take a look at those together.
I think that's great, Kendra. I think we've sort of talked through a lot of questions in chat, so I think we're in good shape to continue along.
Great. Okay. So, what benefit is there to archiving? Well, archiving broadens the impact and reach of ATE as a whole. So the ATE Central Archive provides easy access to materials generated by ATE. Not only is there keyword searching for all the metadata that we were looking at, for the description field, for all the additional information that we add to the record, but the resource portal also offers a number of other search functionalities. There's an advanced search feature, there's faceted search, browsing, that really allow users to hone in on specifically what they're looking for. The archive also allows dissemination of your material beyond those individuals who are already familiar with your project or center, so that really all project and centers can reach a much wider, more diverse audience. It's a single access point. So individuals who are interested in ATE materials in general, let's say an individual is interested in nanotechnology. That person does not need to be familiar with the variety of projects and centers that focus on nano. Rather, they can search a large portion of the materials created by the various projects and centers in a single location. And last, but certainly not least, the archive preserves those valuable resources that you create over a long period of time. So that preservation aspect is also something that benefits a project or center individually, particularly after your funding has sunset and it's come to an end. You can think about the archive as a means of sustainability. So when you do your sustainability planning and you're thinking about where your deliverables are going to live, the ATE Central Archive is a possible solution for you. Also, the archive might be mentioned in your data management plans, and that's something we'll touch briefly on a little bit later on. If you are required to archive, clearly archiving with us does meet the NSF archiving requirement. And finally, we do track use of our website. We have metrics that we provide to you in the form of activity reports. I'll have a URL for you at the end of the presentation if you're not familiar with those reports and would like to take a closer look. But activity reports are provided to you or to the PI of a project or center every 3 months, and you also receive one annual report. And that data might be of use to you for your reporting purposes, either for your annual reporting or some type of internal reporting processes that you follow. And the data might be useful in terms of your own advocacy or for outreach purposes that you engage in for your project or center. So before we move on and talk more about the service itself and the archiving requirement, were there any additional questions, Rachel, that you'd like to address now?
There are a couple that have popped up. One, Helen asked us, do we require certain naming conventions for the files?
We certainly don't require naming conventions, but I will touch on them a little later on. They are recommended as a way of keeping track of information that might otherwise be lost. So strongly recommended, but certainly not required.
Okay, and then someone else asked us about our server capacity. I don't think we have any problem in that area. This is actually something that I don't know the answer to personally, but Ed Almasy is on, and he, I'm sure, does know that. So I just quickly queried him, and he'll answer. I don't think we have any problems with the server capacity. Matthias, I know that we back everything up not only on our own servers, but also to the cloud. And I know Ed has spent a fair amount of time looking at all of that, and I'm sure he'll answer us in just a moment. And then Ken also asked about file formats. If there are specific file formats. I know you're going to go over some of that in a little bit.
I'm sorry. A little later on, we'll be talking about recommended file formats, but I do recognize that individual fields tend to have file formats that are specific to their field of study, and we certainly accept those as well, even though our recommended file formats don't necessarily address that directly. So that's something we would talk about on an individual level if you have file formats that just aren't listed there.
Okay, that's great. Let's move along, and as more questions come up, we can address them. I believe we have another poll here. So Mike just opened the poll for you. We'd just like to know a little bit more about where folks are at the moment. So you can see the answers. I'm not surprised that a lot of folks are saying they're beginning to plan for archiving. That's great for us to see. Nobody's actually trying to decide whether to archive or not. That's kind of exciting news, Kendra.
It is. I hope that means that people have already decided to archive.
Yeah, of course. And if you're if you're clicking on other, we'd love to hear what stage you're at, or why you're sort of joining us in terms of the webinar. It looks like almost everybody's sort of beginning to plan to archive, so that's wonderful. Oh, yeah, somebody just said that they've archived most of their files, working on their first grant and trying to learn about the archiving and the resources. Okay, we're getting some nice answers. All right, that's great. Good information, everybody. I think we can move on.
So, for the rest of the presentation, we're really going to talk more about the services that we offer and what kind of assistance we can provide in terms of your archiving efforts. Before we look more closely at that, I did want to mention that for those of you who are potential grantees, and from our poll at the beginning, it sounds like a handful of you are just getting introduced to the ATE community and are interested in submitting a proposal to NSF. We do provide assistance with formulating some of the wording on your data management plan. So if you'd like to add something about the ATE Central Archive, but you're really just not sure how to put that down on paper, that's something that you're welcome to contact us about, and we can help you think through that process and get that ready for your data management plan. We also provide assistance in terms of the archival planning process, which is what we're going to spend most of today on. We particularly can provide assistance early on in your grant. However, we are more than happy to help you streamline the process if you're a little further along in your grant, or if you're even towards the end of the grant and you are ready to archive. We can certainly help you in any way that you need. Most of the assistance that we provide is on a one-on-one basis, so we'll address those questions as they pertain to your particular situation. We can help you identify which materials are most appropriate for archiving. We'll talk more about this later on. But in the course of your day-to-day business activities, you're going to be generating a lot of materials, some of which are very valuable for your internal purposes, but aren't necessarily appropriate for archiving, and some are very much appropriate, so we can help you think through that process. We will answer any questions you have about the ATE archiving requirement, and if we are unsure of the answer, either Rachel or I would be happy to find that answer for you. We will assist with the ingest of your resources into the ATE Central Archive. We'll talk more about this towards the very end of the presentation when I introduce our new submission form. And finally, like I mentioned briefly earlier, we do track the use of your archival material and provide that information to you, but we won't be coming back to this again during this presentation, so if you do have any questions about the activity report, please feel free to ask us about that. So for the next few slides, we'll be looking at what we call the archiving checklist. This checklist is available on our website at atcentral.net/archiving. I will be providing the URL to you at the end of the webinar. The checklist itself is not meant to be a comprehensive step-by-step guide as to how to archive. It's simply a series of questions that you may find helpful as you start to think about archiving and start working through the archiving process. There are more questions on this checklist than we will be discussing today, so I do welcome all of you to visit our website and look at the full list if you're interested. The checklist was created specifically for the ATE community. However, since a few of you identified yourself as being external to the community, it is also largely applicable to others outside of ATE and can be easily adapted towards your needs regardless of where you might be archiving your materials. Also, it was developed specifically for individuals who are early on in their planning processes or early on in their grants. However, many of these questions will still apply to individuals who are perhaps further along in the grant or are even already ready to archive with us. So, when you begin your planning process, we'd recommend that you start by collecting some general information. If you do fall under the new ATE archiving requirement, which it sounds like at least half of you might, I would encourage you to read the NSF archiving requirement as it is stated in the RFP. Today we're going to cover a lot of it, but it's still a good idea, I think, to go back and just look at the actual requirement. Are you familiar with the ATE Central Archiving Service? This webinar is also, once again, a great first step. You can, however, find a lot more information on our webpage. Once again, I'll give you the URL later, but atcentral.net/archiving. You'll find this archiving checklist as well as a few worksheets and spreadsheets that might be of useful to you in your planning process. It discusses our service, the archiving requirement, details our collection scope in pretty in-depth. There's some digital preservation information. There was a question about formats, so that information is provided on that page. A little bit about intellectual property rights, and then finally detailed submission guidelines if you're thinking about submitting your resources directly to us. Also, ask yourself whether you're familiar with various licensing agreements that are available to you. You are not required to make your materials available under any licenses, such as Creative Commons licenses. However, NSF does recommend that you consider doing so. Specifically, they recommend the attribution share alike, and the attribution non-commercial share alike licenses, and I'll come back to that a little later on. But it's a good idea, even if you haven't decided yet whether you're going to make your materials available or not, just to give these licenses a look so that you're a little more familiar with them. And finally, after you've completed your information collecting process? Do you feel like you're sufficiently informed, or do you still have questions? And if you do, please feel free to ask any of us at AT Central any questions that you might have. We're more than happy to help. And if you do have questions that we can't help with, we might be able to point you in the right direction. Regardless of where you are in your planning process, I would suggest considering assigning the role of archiving specialist. It's just a term that we use. Really what it is your archiving point person, your person who knows everything about your archiving activities. This person might be the PI of the project, or a co-PI, or perhaps a staff person. But what's very helpful is if you select a person who's explicitly responsible for archiving and they know that this is their responsibility, it helps ensure that the archiving process moves along a little more smoothly. If you do have an archiving specialist or a point person, what is this person's responsibility? I'll have some examples for you a little later on, but perhaps you might say, well, this person's responsibility is to develop and implement workflows that support our archiving activities. Perhaps this person's responsibility is to acquire and organize archival materials in a single location. Maybe this person manages your licensing and rights information. If you do decide to license your material, this person could very well be your licensing expert and help others in your organization with questions regarding licensing. Once you've identified this person and have documented those responsibilities, have you communicated that person's role to others inside of the project or center or your project partners? If you have, let's say, a number of faculty members creating curriculum that you're going to archive, do those faculty know that this archiving specialist or point person exists, and do they know to give materials to that person? Do people know who this person is in case they have questions? So communicating that information could be very valuable for your project team. Once you've identified your archiving specialist, regardless if that's the PI or someone else, and you've answered all your questions, it's a good time to start planning your archiving activities. Perhaps you'd like to set archiving goals, and this is something that you certainly may want to consider doing even if you're at the end of your grant cycle. I'll provide some examples of what those goals might look like a little later on, but it could be things like ensuring that you meet the NSF archiving requirement, maintaining the integrity of your materials, so preserving contextual information. We had a question about naming conventions, and this is sort of what we're referring to there, and I'll talk more about this a little later on. Perhaps if you maintain any personal or sensitive information, a goal could be to properly protect that information for the individuals you've collected information on. And we'll look at a few more examples in a moment. Have you identified which materials are suitable for archiving and where they should be stored before you provide them to AT Central? Having a central location for those materials could very well be beneficial so that you're not trying to find those materials stored on a number of different desktop throughout the office later on. And then finally, have you created an archiving schedule to use as a guide? Now, we will look at a few archiving schedule samples in a moment, but really what the archiving schedule is just a documentation of what you are going to create that is archivable, who has that material, when you want to archive it. It's just information to help your archiving specialist know what kind of archiving material they're looking for. And like I said, we'll look at an example here in just a moment. Have you developed a workflow? Have you determined what information you need to preserve the integrity of your archival material? So if you're creating a syllabus, for example, a lot of the information that we would need about the syllabus is on the document. It likely has the name of the course, the name of the instructor, the semester that it was taught in. But if you're creating a series of activities or labs for a particular course, those materials might not have the information we would need to properly archive the materials on the document itself. So this is an opportunity where you might say, okay, I'm going to use naming conventions to keep track of that information to make sure it's not disassociated from the resource. So for those activities or labs, the name of your file might include the course number, the name of the instructor, and the semester that it was taught as part of the naming convention. Thinking about these things in advance can really help you plan and not lose some of that very valuable information. Another possibility, if you're not using naming conventions, is to keep some sort of spreadsheet or some other tool to document important information about your resources. There is a sample spreadsheet on the AT Central website, also at atcentral.net/archiving. And on that spreadsheet, you might not only want to keep some of the information that I just mentioned. Perhaps you are releasing a lot of your documents under different licenses, different CC licenses. Perhaps you want to document that in a single location. Perhaps you're not only keeping your material in the AT Central archive. You might be releasing those materials elsewhere. It might be nice to document that kind of information as well. So thinking in advance about what kind of information you might want to keep, how you're going to keep that information can really save you some work later on. And then finally, there's the follow-up. Have you set an archiving deadline for your project or center? Ideally, that deadline would be before the end of your funding cycle to ensure that you have the staffing, the resources necessary to complete the archiving process. And once you have archived with AT Central or any other repository that you choose to put your materials in, have you reviewed the archival records, those metadata records that we looked on earlier on, to make sure that they're accurate and that they're complete and that you're completely satisfied with the way that they turned out. And please, by all means, we add a lot of metadata to your records, but if there's something that is not entirely correct or if there's something that you would like to see done a little differently, feel free to reach out to us and let us know. We're more than happy to make those edits to make your resources more accessible to your users. So this is an example of the archival planning worksheet. And a lot of what we just discussed is provided here on a single page. Now, I will note that this document is available on our website as both a PDF and a Word document, so you're more than welcome to download it and edit it in any way you would like. It also comes with a one-page explanation as to how to fill it out, should you have additional questions about that. The worksheet is simply a tool. There is no requirement whatsoever to fill this out. It's just a way to help you think through the process if you're looking for a little additional assistance. So on this worksheet, we have information about your project and center and that point person, your archiving specialist. Who is that? Then we have some information about the responsibilities that this person might have. We talked about a few of these. Perhaps that person's responsibility is to develop a workflow, organize materials before they're submitted for archiving, or manage licensing agreements. But this person might also serve as your point person to AT Central or some other repository if you're archiving elsewhere. This is the person who would likely review your archival records in that follow-up stage and make sure that everything is satisfactory. You can use these little checkboxes if you like, and then there's additional space to add more responsibilities if you choose to, or remove some of them if they don't seem applicable to your project or center. And like I said, it is a Word document, so you could edit this any way you like. We have also provided some sample goals just to help get you thinking about what this might look like. We've discussed that perhaps ensuring that you meet the NSF requirement is a goal, but for those of you who are not required to archive, that might not be the case. Maintaining the integrity of the archival materials by preserving contextual information, and how you choose to do so could vary widely. Implementing a workflow that allows for a timely and efficient transfer of all of your materials to either AT Central or some other repository. and ensuring that that personal or sensitive information that I used as an example earlier is properly protected. And of course, you could add or remove any goals that are particular to your project or center. Now, this little box below that, this is the archiving schedule that we talked about in a previous slide. So the idea here is really just to give your archiving specialist, your point person, a frame of reference. What kind of materials should they be looking out for? What should they be collecting? So in the first column, we have some potential resource types: assessment materials, instructional reference, professional development, administrative, or other. These are the way that we at ATE Central think of materials and try to categorize them, but you might have very different record types, and that's perfectly okay. Perhaps you organize a competition or a conference. You're more than welcome to change these as you see fit. I have an example here of instructional material. Perhaps your goal, this is your deliverable, something that you're creating under your grant, is to create materials such as syllabi, lectures, lesson plans, activities, labs, and exams for a particular course that I'm just calling Bio 101. By expressing this in writing, your archiving specialist will have a better idea of what kind of material to collect from the custodians. In this case, the course instructors. Who's going to be creating the curriculum? Most likely the instructors. You could also list the name of the instructors here if that is more helpful to you. And then there's a submission deadline, something to help you try to stay on track. Here in our example, perhaps end of year 2 in a 3-year grant is when you want to try to have your materials for this particular course archived. What's nice about filling out this form early on in your grant cycle, if that's where you are, it helps you think through what materials you already know you're going to be creating, but also might help you identify materials that are a little more challenging. Let's say you organize a competition of sorts. Maybe some type of robotics competition is a deliverable of your grant. Well, what kind of materials are you going to be creating for that kind of competition? What might be archivable? And this archiving schedule might very well be a tool that can help you think through that a little more. The last section of this worksheet is the review process. How frequently will you revisit this worksheet? Now, if you have a 3-year or 4-year grant, or even if it's a 1 or 2-year grant, perhaps you want to visit it every year or every half year. Most of the information on here will stay the same, but what might change is your archiving schedule. You might start creating materials that you originally didn't anticipate, and so you might want to update some of this information. And then finally, when are you going to be done with archiving? Set a date and really try to meet that archiving goal. I have a second example here of professional development materials. A description for your archiving specialist might just be workshop materials such as presentations and handouts created for new instructors. Here we have one custodian, the course coordinator, who's creating the materials. But I've decided to add the second example because the submission deadline here is different. It's a week after new faculty orientation. So the first deadline was really timeline based. This submission deadline is based on an event. So there's really no right and wrong way to fill out this form as long as it makes sense for your project and center. And I am more than happy to help you think through this form in more detail. Now, like I said, this filling out the archival planning worksheet is not a requirement. It's merely a tool to help you with your thought process. But if you do fill it out, please feel free to share it with ATE Central. Provide a copy to me or to Rachel, and if we have this on file, it helps us help you more effectively because we know what kind of materials you're creating. We can help anticipate when you might need to start archiving based on your submission deadlines, and we can help you meet your goals more effectively if we're involved in that planning process. But like I said, that's entirely optional. So what is it that we archive? Like I mentioned before, in general terms, we think of materials as assessment, instructional, reference, and professional development materials. This is primarily the type of thing that we collect. Assessment materials might be tests or answer keys or grading rubrics. Instructional materials covers a wide variety of content, activities, case studies, curriculum in general, activities, lesson plans, simulations, problem sets, syllabi, textbooks, tutorial. ATE creates a wide variety of materials. Reference is referring to things like articles or reports or career development information. And professional development materials generally are things like presentation, workshop materials, and video recordings. We also collect what we call just samples. Samples of materials that you've created, like manuals or guides, best practices, survey tools. So not the survey results, but the actual survey itself, the questions that you think would be valuable to the ATE community as a whole. If you think that others might be interested in conducting the same kind of survey that you conducted, or that your best practice guide might be applicable to other projects and centers, we really welcome that material so that we can make that more accessible to others who might just want to download it and tweak it and use it for their own purposes. And then finally, we do collect select administrative documents. These are materials that are meant to document the success of your project or center, things like internal reports or data sets. This information, though, is not necessarily generally made publicly available. We might just archive it for internal purposes, make it available to NSF or to researchers, but it's not necessarily material that needs to be available to the general public. So, we still have the RFP to look at and the submission guideline, but before we do so, are there any questions about the checklist, the worksheet, or the materials that we collect at AT Central?
So Kendra, we did have a question about someone wanted to know if they had materials that they weren't comfortable being public, and you sort of answered this in just a moment ago. Were we okay with not making those, sort of dark archiving those, so to speak?
So what we do in that case, and it's a very good question because there's an assortment of materials that you might not want to make publicly available. Fee-based materials, there are some centers that charge for their materials. You might not want to put that out there because it could impact your ability to charge that fee. Also, if you're archiving exams that are currently being used, you might not want the answer keys to be publicly available. So there's a number of reasons to do so. In those cases, what we will do is create that metadata record detailing your resource so that they are searchable and discoverable by the ATE community. But those metadata records won't have an attachment or a URL that is viewable to, or let's say an attachment that's viewable to the public. It'll be there for archiving purposes, but it won't be readily viewable. Instead, what the description will say is for access to this material, and then something that we've agreed to. Perhaps contact the project or center directly for more information, and we'll come to some type of agreement as to how you would like to make those materials available, if they are available to anyone at all.
That's great, Kendra. And I think that answers it really clearly. There's also been a lot of folks who are interested in whether we archive videos.
We do archive videos. We do ask that the video be provided to us as a digital file. So unfortunately, we can't download those directly from YouTube if that's where they're currently stored. But if you provide an MP4 file or some other file format that's listed in our video accepted video files, we're more than happy to archive those individually. And if you have them in a file format that is not listed on the website, just let me know and we'll take a look to see if we can accept that particular format as well.
So we do link in the resource collection. If we're just talking about a resource, not archiving it, we can link to YouTube. but we can't download something from YouTube for archiving. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so that was a question that came up too. And there's been some questions too about things like reports and annual reports, final reports that some people actually are very comfortable sharing. Is that something you think we would archive too?
It's not something that we have archived in the past. It's certainly something we can talk about, but it might also be a good place to involve Mentor Connect and see if that might be something that they're interested in talking more about. Rachel, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I think it could be helpful for us to have a couple of those as examples, particularly in some of our sort of, 101 area for new grantees. But I do think that Mentor Connect would probably be very interested in any examples of annual reports and NVC reports, although we also get that question sometimes too, so it's something we can definitely look at. All right, so do we have any other questions? Looks like a couple other people are typing. Let's see, I think we have another poll here. So let's go ahead and open this poll. And then if other questions come up, we can answer them before we get into our last bit. So here we're really just curious about what kinds of materials you feel like you'd want to archive. And you can select more than one of these materials, since most of us have multiple types of materials we'd be archiving. And we would love it if you've ticked that other box, if you would type in what those other things will be. So someone was saying that they would be at High Tech this year, and will any of this be presented there? John, we are not doing a presentation at High Tech, but I will make sure we have copies of the materials. So if you want to stop by the AT Central booth, because we will have a booth there, I can chat with you about it, and Kendra is always available via email for any questions. Let's take a look here at these poll results. Not surprisingly, as you said, Kendra, the assessment and instructional are sort of topping out, although we have a lot of reference too. Lots of great types of materials here.
Yeah, and I'm actually excited to see that so many people are interested in sharing some of their administrative type materials with us as well.
Absolutely. It looks like somebody else put in simulations as one of the others.
That's interesting. We do accept simulations as instructional material so far, but perhaps depending on what that simulation is, it may very well be appropriate for archiving in a different sort of category.
Absolutely. So someone else asked us about the contact name and email for data management planning. They're working on a proposal and they need a little help. And that would be Kendra. I think that would be the appropriate person here. Kendra, you're happy to help someone a little bit with that, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
All right, let's see. We have a few other questions too. If we've published articles in peer-reviewed journals, would you want those references to link? Well, we wouldn't want to link to them, Ken. We'd actually want a copy of it, but we might be able to pull that down depending, right, Kendra?
We would have to look at the individual journal. We would certainly link to it, and of course we'd want to archive it. We'd have to look at the requirements of that journal to see if we can make it, archive it and make it available, or if we just can archive it and not make it publicly available. So
Right,
that's more of a individual journal review type question.
And Charlotte actually just chimed in thank you, Charlotte, from Mentor Connect, saying that they would be very interested in any of the kinds of resources, the report writing resources that Matthias mentioned he had. So that's a nice connection to have. All right, well, I think we can close the poll. And moving along, Kendra, you're going to go over a little bit about the RFP.
Yes, and I'm sure this is a big question on people's minds, especially for those of you who do fall under the new requirement. So what does the RFP say? Specifically, new grantees who apply for and are awarded funding under solicitation NSF 14577 are required to archive their deliverables as described in their initial grant proposals with AT Central. These deliverables are to be in a digital and archivable format with any intellectual property information clearly displayed. So once again, we have some highlights. We're going to look at each of these issues individually. But I just wanted to say a word first about the new grantees who apply and are awarded for. So this includes not only individuals who are applying for funding for the very first time, but also includes, let's say, a center that transitions from one form of a center, like a regional to a national, or for a project or center that receives a second round of funding. So if you have questions about whether you specifically fall under this requirement, please feel free to contact us, and we're more than happy to find out for you. So let's take a look. A deliverable could be, curriculum, professional development material, a manual of guide or some sort, or even a conference, just to name a few. Deliverables of any given project or center will be described in their original grant proposal, though, like I said earlier on, that may change a little bit over time. So that's certainly something that we're happy to discuss. So they're usually relatively easy to identify. If you're not quite sure where to start with the archiving planning process and what your deliverables truly are, go back to your grant proposal and look at the outcomes that you've identified there. It's a really good starting place. But like I said, we're more than happy to help you as well if you're having some trouble identifying those materials. Not all deliverables are digital or even tangible in nature. Earlier on, we talked briefly about a student competition might be one of your deliverables, or perhaps a conference, for example, might be a deliverable of your grant, which is not inherently digital. However, there may very well be support materials that are available in a digital and archivable format, such as handouts or PowerPoint presentations, or perhaps you've decided to videotape your conference. What we consider an archivable format is outlined in our archiving service policy, which is that atcentral.net/archiving. I've taken a screenshot here of the general type of formats that we accept. I will, however, note once again that this is not comprehensive. A number of you work in fields where you have file formats that are very specific to the material that you work, and we are more than happy to take a look at those and make sure that we can archive them as well. These are recommended guidelines, though, if you are going to be creating audio, video, visual, textual, or course content in an LMS, materials that, or the file formats that we recommend. And if you are looking at these at the beginning of your planning process, it may help you make sure that you store your materials in these file formats from the very, very beginning. Now, finally, there's that intellectual property information piece. So under the RFP, grantees are encouraged to make their materials available under a Creative Commons license. Specifically, NSF encourages the use of the attribution share alike, and attribution non-commercial share alike licenses. These licenses allow users to copy, distribute, transmit, and just generally adapt copyrighted works to varying degrees as long as they attribute and share their work in the manner specified. Now, what NSF does ask is that if you do choose to use a Creative Commons license, that license be affixed to the work itself. So if it's a PDF document, make sure that you have the attribution somewhere in the first few pages of your document, or add it to a PowerPoint presentation. It's pretty common, and I'm sure all of you've seen this somewhere, that CC attributions are only added to a website and it says any material available here is available under this license. While you're more than welcome to do that, in order to archive those individual documents with us, though, we do ask that you iterate that information on the document itself. So that brings us to submitting for archiving. This is our last topic for today's webinar. We just recently launched an a submission form on our website. The URL is finally listed for you there, atcentral.net/archiving. You do need to be logged into your account in order to access the submission form. Currently, it's linked under our submission guidelines at the bottom of that URL. However, later on, it'll be in other places on the website as well. But you can certainly already access this form. We accept through this form 3 different types of materials. You can submit individual resources for archiving, so perhaps you have a research report or a PowerPoint presentation or just an individual file that you would like to archive. I should note that you can only upload 1 document that is a max of 1 GB to this form. So if you have more than 1 resource, let's say you have a collection of related resources, and what I mean by that is, let's say you have for a particular module that you just completed, you have a lesson plan, you have an activity, you have some PowerPoint presentations, and you have an exam. Those materials are clearly related to one another because they're all taught in the same module. Feel free to drop those into a zip file and then to upload the zip file as your individual document. Finally, we also accept entire academic courses. Now, you might recall from one of those previous slides that we were just looking at that one of the file formats that we accept is the .imscc file. This is the file format that you will receive if you export your entire academic course out of an LMS. Let's say you're using Blackboard. It is possible to export that entire course in a single file. And we do archive those files so that others can take the IMSCC files and just upload it into their own learning management system. If you go to the URL provided, the atcentral.net/archiving, there are detailed guidelines on how to submit an academic course. All of these materials are discussed in detail, but if you are interested in submitting the academic course, I do encourage you to look at those guidelines specifically or just to contact me with questions. When you fill out this form, there are some required fields. Those are indicated for you with these little yellow circles. The required fields include an associated file, so you have to upload either your individual file or a zip file. Your award number, contact information will be automatically populated for you based on your login information. And then you are required to accept these terms here. Now, what these terms essentially say is that you are either the copyright owner of the material that you're submitted, because remember, we can only archive material that is created by ATE community members, or you are a representative of the person who has the copyright to these materials, and that you grant Internet Scout Research Group, which is the organization where ATE Central lives, the permission to use, copy, migrate, and migrate these materials for preservation and archiving purposes, and that we are also authorized to the unrestricted distribution of these materials via the AT Central Resource Portal or social media outlets. Now, if you are submitting materials that you do not want made publicly available and distributed, I'd encourage you to contact me directly rather than using this submission form, because you do have to actually check that box in order for the form to submit. There's a few optional fields. You can give your resource a title. This is a nice thing to do because you will be given the opportunity to track where your resources or your submissions are in the archiving process, and this will help you identify which materials and what stage in the process. The description field is a paragraph field that you can use in any way you see fit. Perhaps you've written a description for the resource that you're submitting that you've used in some other context. Please feel free to paste that in there. Otherwise, you can also just add notes, information that you might want us to have about the resources. Feel free to add an ATE area if you'd like. If you don't, we will add that information. I'd appreciate it if you just gave me your project or center name. That way we can just verify that the award number is correct. And if you're interested in learning more about licensing, feel free to check this little box. You won't receive an email immediately as of yet, but you will hear from someone at AT Central with a little more information about licensing in general. So before I move on, I just want to note that if you are submitting you're submitting individual resources that are unrelated, since we've talked about related resources here. Let's say you have 3 reports, but they're not related in any way. Feel free to fill out the submission form multiple times. You can submit as much material through this form as you would like to. If you are at the end of your funding cycle and you have a lot of material, please don't feel obligated to have to use the form at this point. Feel free to contact me directly, especially if you have a few dozen, maybe even hundreds of materials, and we'll discuss how best to submit that to AT Central so that you don't need to fill out this form over and over again. So, and with that, I will pass this back to Rachel for a final poll question.
You know, before we do the poll, there have been a bunch of questions that have come up, Kendra, and one of them, somebody specifically asked, why would anyone submit an entire course? They asked what would be the motivation for doing so, since online education is so highly competitive these days. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And Kendra, please chime in too if you have some other thoughts on this. But we've had people who have submitted an entire course who were concerned about the longevity of the course at their institution. So it's something that's been taught. They weren't sure if it was going to continue to be taught. But also keep in mind, and it was created under AT funding, and they wanted to make sure that it was sustained in the original format that they'd created it in, because they were actually retiring. And so they wanted to make sure that this particular course was sustained over time as they had created it. But remember too that just because you submit it and it's archived does not mean it's publicly available. So it could be that you work with your institution and say, this won't be available to anyone else. We'd like to preserve it within the AT Central Archive so that it's there sort of long term, but we won't make it available, let's say, as long as it's being taught at our institution. If, however, it's not being taught at some future date, then maybe it is available for folks to look at in case someone wants to build or leverage off that. I hope that's helpful. Kendra, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Thanks, Rachel. I think that is very helpful. And while I do agree that academics are very competitive, especially in advanced fields, I do think that there's just generally a lot of individuals in the AT community who want to share their work and are excited about the prospect of other people using the materials that they've created in their course to teach those courses elsewhere.
The other thing thanks Kendra, and the other thing that came up is that Max asked, does the RFP says you should archive, but does it appear in the terms and conditions of the award letter? And it's a great question, and it doesn't. So it is a requirement, just like the Evaluate survey is a requirement, but you won't see it in the terms and conditions at this point of your award letter. So that means that it is strongly, strongly, strongly recommended, but they can't really do much to enforce it, is I believe how we interpret that. All right, let me see if there are any other questions before we... no, I think we're good. So let's go ahead and open this final poll. So now that you've kind of learned a little bit more about the archiving process, where do you feel like you still feel like you'd like a little more information or help? This just helps us as we start to think about what goes on the website, future webinars, future workshops. We'll probably try to be doing a presentation at the ATE PI conference this fall. So, this is really helpful for us. Interesting, that licensing and IP issues, not surprisingly, is the highest one. Although second is all of above. So, and again, if you typed in other, or if you clicked on other, could you type in the chat box just so we know kind of if there's an area we haven't covered or something you're just interested in? All right, a couple people are typing for us here. Let's see. I do think that one of the reasons we put the checkbox when you submit that checkbox on I'd like more information on licensing was just for this reason, because we felt that this is probably an area people feel like they don't have enough info about. All right, well, let's go ahead and close that poll down. I haven't gotten anything specific yet in terms of other, but please follow up with email for us if you'd like to. So more information. Kendra, do you want to go over this list for folks?
Sure. So here are a number of links to our website with more information about some of the topics we talked about today. The first, atcentral.net/DMP, is data management planning. So for those of you who are just at the initial stage of applying for a grant, this may be a resource that you're interested in. The next URL, /archiving, contains much of the information that we covered today, and hopefully will answer some additional questions if you still have some. /AR guide is activity report guide. I mentioned briefly once or twice in the presentation that we do collect information about the way our resources are accessed through the AT Central website and share that with you via the activity reports. This is just more information about those reports if you're not familiar with them. And then the /sustainability page is content that Rachel's been working on and talks more about sustainability planning in general. Towards the bottom of the slide, just a little different additional information if you want to learn more about copyright in general. The .gov website here is recommended, as well as a link directly to the creativecommons.org website if you're interested in learning more about those licenses that I mentioned.
All right, so we do have a few other questions. Somebody was asking, how can they remove archive materials? Is there a way to remove archive materials once it's submitted? Or in fact, there was another question where someone asked, what happens if I want to update material? So those are sort of similar. Maybe Kendra, can you address those briefly?
Sure. If you'd like to update materials that we've already submitted, that can happen in one or two ways. Provide us with a file of the updated material, and if it is something where you just made a few minor tweaks and just sort of improved the material in some way, we can replace it with your newer submission. If, however, it's something that you update regularly, let's say a handbook, and every year you come out with a new version of your handbook, we would actually keep the older versions and make those available as previous versions if you'd like us to, and have the most recent version as the associated file on your record. The previous versions do not need to be made available, but they can be if you'd like to. Hopefully, individuals wouldn't want to remove resources from the site after they've been archived, but if there is a reason to do so, you would just contact me directly and we can figure out if that's the best solution for your situation.
And someone else asked about Creative Commons, and we're kind of confused about how the licensing information should be submitted, and they were asking, is that part of the zip? And I think it's on each individual document. Is that right, Kendra?
Creative Commons actually does an excellent job of explaining how to affix their licenses to different types of materials. So they have URLs or web pages where they just talk about this in great detail, and I'm happy to provide more specific URLs to anyone who's looking to figure out how to do that.
All right, great. Well, I think we've gotten to all the questions that were asked, and if we missed one, I really apologize. This was really great, really rich, a lot of rich discussion and interaction, but it's sometimes a little bit hard to keep up in the chat window. So if we missed one, I really apologize, but please feel free to email us. I think our next slide gives our contact information, and we're also asking you to please fill out the survey, which I think is about to be launched. This is just a little survey that just helps us understand how we did, and it should open in a new window for you. If you're on a Mac, sometimes it's a little tricky. It may open behind something, but you should be able to find the survey. Hopefully you're all finding that. If you're having any trouble, pop a question in the chat window to us. Thanks, Mary. Mary just sent a very nice note. Thank you. we're really happy to be working on this. It's very exciting and really, I think, something that's needed, for the community. We're thrilled to be able to help preserve all the good work that you all are doing.
Rachel, it's Mike. I'd just like to come in at the end here. I'm going to place the survey question in the chat window and as you say, some Macs won't necessarily launch this depending on firewalls, and you can actually click on it right in the chat window or some other way of doing it. But the survey is launching on all of our test machines, so I think we're okay there. Rachel, I had a question for you. Is the entire NSF into this digital archiving now? What if I work in one of the research directorates? Is it an NSF-wide thing?
Well, I mean, I think that NSF's, when the data management planning requirements started, it was a clear indicator that not only NSF but other government entities were very concerned about preserving not only digital materials but data. We have we tend in ATE to have a little bit less sort of pure data to preserve, but I think it's a huge issue all over the federal government and within granting agencies. I think we may be one of the only NSF programs to have our own archive like this. So I think it's sort of a unique thing to ATE Central,
Cool.
to the ATE program rather.
Cool. Rachel, there was a ton of questions today. I did think that you got to most of them. And we're still live as people are answering the survey questions. They still hear us, so they hear us talking. I had a question for Kendra. Kendra, it seems like you live and breathe digital archiving. Do you dream about it at night? You seem so for this topic. It's really great.
Well, thank you. No. Luckily, I get home every day.
She gets a break at night.
That's good.
And he definitely distracts me otherwise.
Okay. Well, Rachel and Kendra, I wanted to thank you both for the presentation today. Just a huge interest with the number of people online and sticking through with all their questions. And we always appreciate people in the chat window giving advice to other people, for example, where they can find creative common information and things like that. So that's cool.
That was great, and I think Kendra is so deeply knowledgeable about that. So please, everyone, feel free to email either of us, but particularly Kendra, because in the end, if you email me, I'll probably just forward it to her. So she's really our in-house expert, and we look forward to seeing you guys either at High Tech or at the PI conference, and hopefully we'll have a presentation there. And of course, you can always stop by our booth or visit the website as we mentioned.
That's great. Friends, Kendra, Rachel, and colleagues online, this officially ends today's webinar. I'm going to stop the recording now, and you will be sent a link to the recording and the slides as well. Kendra and Rachel, thank you again. That officially ends today's webinar. I'll leave the survey up for a few more minutes. So go ahead and just click your microphones off, Rachel and Kendra, and that concludes our presentation today. Bye, everyone.